The night air over the Pacific was heavy with salt and fear. Inside a dim concrete room beneath Tokyo's Army Communications Bureau, a single bulb buzzed and swung on its wire, casting long shadows across rows of radios, tape reels, and exhausted men hunched over headsets. Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka rubbed his temples. He had been listening to the same recording for 7 hours, bursts of sound that made no sense, syllables tumbling like stones in a storm. "Repeat section A-17, he ordered. A technician spun the reel again. Todinebikeya shashbeesh bida ajiu nadoe. The alien words poured through the speaker, rhythmic, sharp, alive. Tanaka's pencil stopped. "It's not English," he murmured. "Not German. Not any dialect we know." Captain Saito, his superior, leaned over the desk. "Then what is it, Lieutenant?" Tanaka hesitated. "It sounds indigenous. But which?" Outside, rain tapped against the shuttered windows. Tokyo slept fitfully while across the ocean, American carriers crawled closer every week. The Empire's cryptographers had cracked British naval codes, Australian dispatches, even fragments of the American Army's older ciphers. Yet this language, mocked them. Saito slammed his fist against the table. "We intercepted dozens of these in the last month. Every major assault, Tarawa, Bougainville, their transmissions use this same pattern. Every time we jam their frequencies, new ones appear. It's chaos." He turned to Tanaka. "I want an answer. Tomorrow." When the captain left, the room fell back into the hum of machines. Tanaka stared at the reel as it spun, the strange words whispering through static. There was rhythm in them, not mechanical, but human. Like the rise and fall of chanting. He reached for his notebook. On the margin he wrote, "Possible code, based on phonetic substitution, unknown source language." Then, after a long pause, could this be a Native American tongue? The idea sounded absurd even to him. The Americans were using farmers, teachers, and now tribesmen? Yet the precision of the messages, their timing with U.S. movements, couldn't be ignored. Across the ocean, on a coral-scarred island in the Solomons, Private Ben Yazzie pressed his headset against his ear and shouted over the roar of artillery. "Message incoming, Sergeant." Mud splashed his face. He crouched behind a ridge, radio on his back, microphone clutched like a lifeline. "He got it," Sergeant Begay replied. "Send coordinates to the 5th Marines." Ben adjusted the frequency, heart pounding. "Da natatkin." Words flew from his tongue, quick, musical, effortless. Around him, white-helmeted Marines stared in disbelief at the speed of his transmission. Within minutes, the American artillery answered shells screaming overhead, finding their marks with terrifying precision. When the smoke cleared, the sergeant clapped Ben's shoulder. "They still can't touch our code." Ben grinned, teeth flashing through grime. "They can't touch our language." The Navajo words carried power older than any cipher. Every mountain, river, and shadow in their homeland had names that meant stories, not just sounds. Now those stories were saving lives. That night, the Marines huddled around ration fires while the jungle hissed. Ben cleaned his radio, thinking of his grandmother's voice back in Arizona, singing prayers at dawn. She had told him their language was sacred, a bridge between earth and sky. He never imagined it would become a weapon. In Tokyo, Tanaka pored over linguistics reports borrowed from the Imperial University. Native American languages, Navajo, Hopi, Cherokee. He underlined Navajo. Its complexity was staggering, verbs changing with direction, sound, and sacred context. No written alphabet, few non-Navajo had ever mastered it. He looked up as rain thundered outside. "Impossible," he whispered. "Could they have found speakers?" He pushed the thought away. Yet 2 nights later, a fresh intercept arrived. Same voice pattern, same strange beauty. "Nats ilid beish bidat sosts idnadom." The Japanese linguists compared the phonemes against every database. Nothing matched. One suggested it might be a deliberate gibberish cipher. Another theorized it was Asian, perhaps a disguised form of Tagalog. Tanaka shook his head. No, it has order. Listen, repetition here, inflection there. It's a grammar. Saito frowned. Then we find someone who speaks it. Who? Tanaka asked. There are no Native Americans in Asia. Then bring me magic, the captain snapped. Because that's what this sounds like. On the island of Saipan, Ben Yazzie learned what war truly cost. The beaches were littered with twisted metal, and bodies half buried in sand. He had been transmitting for 20 hours straight. Every code word he spoke, Beshlo for submarine, Ne-hi-ma for enemy, Wul-le-chi for ant, carried the weight of hundreds of lives. When dawn broke, he removed his headset and sat staring at the sea. The horizon shimmered gold. He thought of home-red cliffs, wind through sagebrush. Sergeant Begay joined him, lighting a cigarette. Heard command, say Tokyo's crying. Their cryptographers can't touch our messages. Ben smiled weakly. I hope they never do. Begay exhaled smoke. They won't. Our tongue's not just words. It's prayers, songs, wind. You can't break the wind. Ben didn't answer. He was too tired to think of poetry. Yet those words stayed with him long after the smoke faded. By late 1944, Japanese Intelligence Bureau 31 was obsessed. Walls were covered with charts, phonetic breakdowns, frequency analyses, all leading nowhere. Tanaka barely slept. His superiors demanded results. His colleagues whispered about punishment. Some suspected American deception. Maybe the code wasn't real at all. Maybe it was recordings designed to waste their time. One night, after yet another failure, Tanaka's assistant burst in, breathless. Sir, we captured a radio from Guam American Marines. It contains message fragments. Tanaka hurried to the lab. The captured radio was battered, but intact. A scrap of paper was found inside the case, a list of English words beside strange ones. He read aloud, Che da ga hi equals turtle equals tank. Then, Wo-la-chi equals ant equals enemy. He froze. These are code equivalents. The assistant grinned. Then we have it. We can decode. No, Tanaka's voice was hollow. You don't understand. These aren't invented words. They're a real language, one we can't read or pronounce. He stared at the paper. The realization hit like cold steel. They weren't facing mathematics. They were facing culture. Centuries of oral tradition turned into encryption. For the first time in his career, Hiroshi Tanaka felt small. Weeks later, a typhoon slammed Japan. Tanaka stood at the window watching lightning split the sky. The storm sounded eerily like the recordings, those rolling syllables, that fierce rhythm. He wondered what kind of people spoke in thunder. At that same hour, far across the ocean, Ben Yazzie crouched in a foxhole on Iwo Jima. Shells tore the island apart. The ground trembled like the earth's heart breaking. Yazzie! Send it now! Begay shouted. Ben grabbed his microphone. To dine bikea ashki beige. Bida jil nadon. His voice cut through explosions, carrying coordinates that guided American guns inch by inch across black volcanic stone. Above them, smoke columns rose like ghosts. The Navajo words danced through static, crossing the sea, bouncing from ship to ship, and somewhere, in a dark Tokyo basement, Tanaka's men heard them again and knew defeat was speaking. He slammed his notebook shut. We'll never break it, he whispered. His assistant blinked. Never? Tanaka looked at the ceiling as thunder cracked. Not in 1,000 years. When Iwo Jima fell, the Empire's last hope of decoding the enemy's messages died with it. Reports from the front described terrifying accuracy, American artillery that struck before the Japanese could even move. Headquarters demanded answers. How do they coordinate so fast? Tanaka handed them a folder of transcripts. Because they speak a language the world doesn't know. We can decipher numbers, but not souls. The room went silent. For the first time, even his superiors looked afraid. On the beach at Iwo Jima, Ben Yazzie found a moment of quiet. The wind carried the smell of sulfur and salt. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pouch of red sand from home, his grandmother's gift. He sprinkled it into the Pacific and whispered, "For all who can't speak anymore." Somewhere, an American officer approached, clapping his shoulder. "You boys saved the day again! The brass says that language of yours is the best code ever made." Ben smiled faintly. "It's not a code, it's who we are." The officer frowned, not understanding. But Ben didn't explain. Some things didn't need translation. Back in Tokyo, as the bombs began to fall and the empire crumbled, Tanaka sat alone in the communications room. The power flickered. He put on his headphones one last time, tuning through empty frequencies. Then, faint, distant, he caught it. Yaat e shinali, shi bikeado ke nihi ya duleo. He didn't understand the words, but the tone stopped his breath. It wasn't the sound of an enemy, it was the sound of prayer. He removed the headset slowly and whispered to himself, "Even our gods cannot translate that." The building shuddered as sirens wailed across Tokyo. Tanaka closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the sea, the voices in the static had already won, not just the war, but something deeper. The jungle steamed under the rain. It wasn't just wet, it was alive, breathing, groaning, whispering through every leaf. On the island of Bougainville, 1943, Private Ben Yazzie crouched in the mud beside his field radio, a black cord running up the hill to a makeshift antenna swaying in the wind. His helmet was dented, his hands shaking, but his voice, that was steady. "Toe shashbe kiyate wo lachi du natsilid." The words rolled off his tongue like a storm chant. They cut through thunder, bullets, and the unending scream of planes overhead. Sergeant Begay, beside him, scribbled the decoded coordinates. "Tell 'em to fire. Right on the ridge, by the palms." Ben relayed the message in Navajo, fingers slick with rain. Seconds later, the ridge erupted in orange light. The ground shook. Distant screams were swallowed by the storm. Begay exhaled, right on target. Ben looked at the clouds boiling above them. The lightning flashed again, for a moment painting their faces silver. "They'll never crack it," he said quietly. Begay nodded. "No machine can catch the wind." Back in Tokyo, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka hadn't slept in 2 days. The intercepted recordings had grown dozens now, all identical in structure but indecipherable. Every morning, the radio room filled with the same haunting syllables. They played them over and over, men scribbling frantically, ears straining for patterns that refused to appear. Wulachi, tsa, biesh du twij. Tanaka stood behind the operators, arms crossed. He could feel their frustration radiating off them. One slammed his headphones down, shouting, "It's meaningless noise." "No," Tanaka said softly. "It means something. Every sound repeats with intent. There's rhythm." Captain Saito entered, his face grim. "The Emperor's office demands results. If this code cannot be broken, the fleet cannot defend itself." Tanaka hesitated. "It is not a code, sir. It's a language." Saito glared. "Then learn it." "With respect," Tanaka said, voice trembling. "No man alive in Japan speaks this tongue." Saito's eyes hardened. "Then find one who does." When the captain left, Tanaka slumped into his chair. "Find one," he muttered bitterly. "As if I can summon ghosts from another continent." He pulled a cigarette from his coat, lit it, and stared at the map on the wall, red pins marking the Pacific Islands where these strange transmissions had appeared. Each pin was a loss. Each loss was a voice, speaking a language Japan could not silence. On Bougainville, the rain finally stopped. Steam rose from the ground, turning the jungle into a shimmering mirage. Ben Yazzie removed his helmet, letting the damp air touch his shaved head. He could smell gunpowder and rot. The battle was over for now, but the jungle never slept. Nearby, Marines gathered around a smoking campfire, passing tin mugs of coffee. The radio men, the code talkers, sat apart, cleaning their gear. They weren't like the others. Their words were their weapons. "Hey, Navajo!" a Marine called out, grinning. "Say something in that secret code of yours." Ben smiled politely. "It's not a code. It's just our language." The Marine laughed. "Yeah? Well, it's saving our hides. Keep talking." Ben returned to his work, but inside he felt a flicker of pride. For years, their language had been mocked, forbidden in schools, beaten out of children. Now it was the one tongue the enemy couldn't touch. Later, as night fell, the men gathered near the foxholes. Sergeant Begay pulled a harmonica from his pocket and began to play low, mournful notes, blending with the chirping insects. Ben closed his eyes. The sound took him back to Arizona, to red mesas and starlit skies, to his grandmother's prayers carried on wind that smelled of cedar smoke. When the song ended, Begay said softly, "Do you think they'll ever know who we are back home?" Ben shrugged. "Maybe one day. Or maybe the war will forget us." Begay smiled sadly. "Not if we remember ourselves." Thousands of miles away, in a cramped university basement in Kyoto, linguists huddled around a phonograph. The Imperial Army had sent Tanaka's recordings there, desperate for new insight. Professors of Asian, European, even Polynesian languages listened for hours. One old scholar adjusted his spectacles. "This is not any Asian tongue," he said. "It's from the Americas, the New World." Tanaka leaned forward. "Can you identify which?" The professor frowned. "It sounds Athabascan, perhaps, related to Apache or Navajo." Tanaka's pulse quickened. "You're certain?" "As certain as one can be hearing ghosts," the old man murmured. "But even if you knew the tribe, it would do you no good. Their grammar is alive. It changes shape with context. You cannot translate it without a soul who has lived it." Tanaka sat back, defeated. "Then it's unbreakable." The professor looked at him with weary eyes. "Not unbreakable, Lieutenant. Just beyond reach. Some things are meant to stay in their own world." Weeks later, the Imperial Army captured an American radio set on Guam. Inside it were notes half-burned, smudged, but legible enough to confirm the impossible. The Americans were indeed using native soldiers as code operators. Tanaka brought the discovery straight to Saito. "Here, sir, look." Saito skimmed the page. "Navajo, what is that?" "A tribe from America's deserts," Tanaka replied. "Their language is unique, no written form, spoken only by their people. The Americans have weaponized it." Saito frowned. "So we lose battles because of primitive tribesmen?" Tanaka hesitated. "Because of brilliance, sir. They turned culture into encryption." Saito tossed the papers onto the desk. "Then we must outsmart them. Mathematics defeats superstition." But Tanaka knew better. He had spent months studying these voices. They weren't superstition. They were precision, ancient and fluid, human yet untouchable. When he returned to his office, he played one of the recordings again. "Ah hei he shi ke do dine." It was a simple message, yet it carried power. The tone, the cadence, the warmth. It didn't sound like war. It sounded like prayer. He took off his headphones slowly. "You can't break a prayer," he whispered. On the front lines, Ben Yazzie and the other code talkers kept moving. Each island was the same story: jungle, fear, smoke, and survival. But the radio never stopped singing. During the assault on Guam, they transmitted over 800 messages in 2 days. Not one was ever decoded or delayed. Commanders called them ghost voices, invisible and perfect. Once, an officer asked Ben, "How can you remember all those words? You talk faster than any machine." Ben smiled. "Because I'm not memorizing numbers. I'm telling stories." Every Navajo word had meaning. Ne he ma didn't just mean enemy. It meant those who come without harmony. To'e didn't just mean water. It meant life itself. They weren't transmitting codes. They were transmitting identity. After one particularly brutal battle, Ben sat alone by the shoreline. The ocean glowed faintly in the moonlight. His hands trembled from exhaustion, but his heart was steady. He thought of the Japanese cryptographers somewhere across that vast sea, men like him, listening, trying to understand. He almost pitied them. How could they? To understand his language, they would have to understand his people. And that, he knew, was beyond any cipher machine. In Tokyo, Tanaka's health was failing. His eyes ached, his hands shook. Still, he worked. The city was being bombed nightly, now glass shattered, sirens wailed, but he refused to leave the bunker. Each time he played the recordings, he felt less like a scientist and more like a man eavesdropping on something sacred. His assistant approached timidly one night. "Sir, why do you still listen? The war is nearly lost." Tanaka stared at the spinning reel. "Because I want to understand the people who beat us. Not with guns, but with words." The assistant said nothing. Outside, the bombs fell closer. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Still, Tanaka sat, headphones pressed to his ears, as the Navajo syllables poured through static like rain. He began jotting notes in the margins, not translations, but feelings, sounds like wind, rhythm of water, voice of mountains. When his assistant glanced over, he asked quietly, "Are these linguistic notes?" Tanaka smiled faintly. "No, they're poetry." At dawn, on a small island near the Philippines, Ben Yazzie woke to the sound of artillery. The sky burned orange. Orders came fast. They were to relay coordinates to incoming bombers. He adjusted his frequency, fingers moving on instinct. To e natsilit bish, bida da nazni. Shells screamed overhead. The ground shook like thunder. For hours, he transmitted sweat pouring, voice hoarse, heart racing. Every word meant survival. Every syllable was a bullet deflected. When the battle finally ended, the American commander gathered the Navajo team. "You boys don't realize it yet," he said, "but you're making history. Without your language, half this fleet would be at the bottom of the sea." Ben only nodded. He didn't need glory. He just wanted to go home alive and for his people's voice to live a little longer in a world that had tried to erase it. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the cryptographers gathered for their final meeting. Saito looked pale, defeated. The Empire's communication lines were collapsing, supply convoys destroyed. Tanaka stood by the wall of charts, thousands of characters that meant nothing. He felt strangely calm. "The Americans have built a fortress out of words," he said softly, "and we have no weapon for that." Saito glared. "Then you admit failure." Tanaka nodded. "Yes, but it's a beautiful failure." Saito slammed his fist on the desk. "You think beauty matters when we are burning?" Tanaka looked up. "It's all that's left." That night, he walked through the streets of Tokyo. Fires burned in the distance. He heard the sirens again rising, falling, and for a brief moment, they sounded like the voices he'd been studying for months. He smiled sadly. Even the wind speaks their language now. Across the ocean, Ben Yazzie sat on the deck of a transport ship heading toward Iwo Jima. The stars stretched endlessly above him. He thought of his family, his people, and the strange, unseen men in Japan who were trying so hard to capture his voice. He whispered into the sea, in Navajo, "May they hear us, but never understand." The waves carried his words eastward, toward the men who listened night after night in vain. And somewhere in Tokyo, in a dark room filled with static, Hiroshi Tanaka did hear them, and understood only that some languages were not meant to be conquered, only respected. The city of Tokyo groaned like a wounded animal. By early 1945, the air itself tasted of smoke. Allied bombers came almost every night now, painting the sky red, turning wooden homes into glowing skeletons. The once shining capital of the empire was a maze of rubble and ash. Beneath it, hidden under layers of reinforced concrete, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat in the intelligence bunker, surrounded by the only thing still unbroken static. The recordings kept coming, endless reels of intercepted Allied transmissions, each filled with the same ghostly language. The more they listened, the less They understood. Wol la chi, tse, beish du twish. Those sounds were now the soundtrack of their failure. Tanaka's uniform hung loose on his frame. He'd stopped eating properly weeks ago. His colleagues avoided his eyes. No one wanted to be the one to tell him the truth he already knew. They were defeated by a song. The latest memo from the Imperial High Command lay unopened on his desk. He didn't need to read it. It would say the same thing all the others had. Crack the code or die trying. He pressed the headphones tighter to his ears, tuning the dial. The static whispered and shifted, and then the voice came again. Calm, steady, certain. Toe shash dubi eshbida na adon. Tanaka closed his eyes. He had memorized those syllables. He didn't know what they meant, but he could almost feel their rhythm in his pulse. It was like listening to the heartbeat of another world. Lieutenant. A thin, nervous operator stood behind him, holding a fresh intercept sheet. From the Iwo Jima frequency, sir. The Americans are preparing something large. Tanaka took the page. There were notes scribbled in pencil. Message sent in Navajo. Duration 27 seconds. Repeated twice. He set the headphones down and leaned back. Iwo Jima, he murmured. They'll hit the homeland next. The operator swallowed hard. Sir, is there any chance we'll break it? Tanaka looked up, eyes hollow. Have you ever tried to catch a storm with your hands? On the island itself, Private Ben Yazi was already living inside that storm. The beach at Iwo Jima was black sand and death. Smoke clung to the air like oil. Tanks burned, bodies floated in the surf, and the cries of the wounded mixed with the mechanical hum of the Navy's bombardment. Ben crouched behind a shattered dune, radio pressed to his chest, whispering coordinates through the roar. To-e na-a-sha, che-da-gahi beish ya-te. His voice barely rose above the shell fire, but it didn't need to. Every word traveled instantly through secure frequencies to ships waiting offshore. Within minutes, the American guns answered thunder rolling over the island like the anger of gods. Beside him, Sergeant Begay loaded fresh batteries into a spare set. Keep going! The generals say we're the only link left! Ben nodded, sweat streaking his face through ash. His throat was raw, his hands shaking, but he kept speaking. Every word in his language, every sacred syllable, was a bullet that couldn't be stopped. In Tokyo, Tanaka's team had no sleep, no air, no hope. The walls rattled from distant explosions. Dust drifted from the ceiling onto their papers and teacups. Each intercepted message from Iwo Jima arrived like a dagger brief, beautiful and utterly impenetrable. Could it be tonal? One linguist asked, wild-eyed from exhaustion. Like Chinese. Maybe the meaning changes with pitch. Another slammed his fist on the table. We've tested that. Every combination. It's nonsense. Tanaka watched them argue, their sanity fraying. He saw himself reflected in their despair. Once, he had believed that language was simply math disguised as sound. Now, he knew better. This wasn't math. It was magic. At midnight, he climbed the stairs to the street. The air outside was thick with smoke. Fires glowed on the horizon. The American bombers were close again. He watched tracer lines streak the night sky and thought, somewhere above, those voices are guiding them. The sound of his own people dying echoed faintly through the city. He wondered if those distant code talkers realized what their words were doing here, how one language was helping to erase another. For the first time, Tanaka whispered a prayer, not for victory, just for understanding. On Iwo Jima, Ben Yazi's unit moved inland inch by inch. The terrain was hell-jagged rock, tunnels, snipers. The air reeked of sulfur and fear. They lost 2 code talkers that morning. One was hit by a mortar while transmitting. The other died shielding his radio with his body. Ben didn't cry. There wasn't time. He just kept working. He could hear the other Navajo Marines on nearby frequencies, their voices flowing through the static calm, measured, unwavering, even under fire. To-e na-sha, eh-hey-hey. Message received. He realized, listening to them, that their entire nation, their ancestors, their songs, lived in that radio network now. The Navajo tongue had become a living shield, invisible and eternal. When the flag finally rose over Mount Suribachi, the Marines cheered until their voices broke. Ben watched from the valley below, mud on his face, tears in his eyes. He wasn't thinking of victory. He was thinking of his grandmother. She had told him once, "Our words are sacred. They are not for shouting." Now he whispered into the headset, "Grandmother, I shouted our words across the ocean, and they saved us." In Tokyo, Tanaka read the same news days later. The radio broadcast called it a heroic stand. Privately, everyone knew it was slaughter. The admiral in charge of intelligence threw a teacup against the wall. How can they coordinate so perfectly? How do they strike every bunker, as if guided by demons? Tanaka spoke quietly. "Not demons, sir. Just language." The admiral turned on him. "Language? Then break it!" Tanaka hesitated. "It cannot be broken." The admiral's face turned red. "Everything breaks." Tanaka looked him in the eye. "Not this. Not because of how it's built, but because of who built it." The room fell silent. Someone muttered, "He's lost his mind." Perhaps he had, but in that moment, Tanaka knew something none of them could admit, that this war had turned men into ghosts chasing ghosts. Later that night, as air raid sirens wailed, he stayed alone in the radio room, listening one last time. Through the static came another transmission, clear, precise, almost tender. "Ya ate shi nali. To e ya ate." He didn't know what it meant, but it didn't sound like war. It sounded like peace spoken by someone who still remembered how. He wrote the syllables down phonetically, just to feel them on paper. Then he tore the page out and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know why, perhaps to remind himself that somewhere, someone could still make beauty out of chaos. On Iwo Jima, the battles dragged on. The Japanese fought to the last man, their bunkers honeycombing the island like tombs. One afternoon, Ben's unit captured a small radio outpost, Japanese equipment, still warm. Inside, they found notebooks filled with scribbles, charts, and strange phonetic markings. Bigay flipped through them, frowning. "Looks like they were trying to decode us." Ben took the book and stared at the familiar syllables written by foreign hands. His language, his people's words laid bare on enemy paper, dissected like an insect. He felt something tighten in his chest. "They never will," he said quietly. Bigay nodded. "Good. Some things aren't for them to understand." Ben tore the pages out and threw them into the fire. The smoke rose, twisting upward, carrying their words back into the sky. In Tokyo, weeks later, Tanaka felt the city crumble around him. The emperor's voice finally came across the radio. Surrender. The unthinkable had happened. Tanaka sat motionless as the words sank in. Men around him wept, shouted, or fell silent. He simply reached into his pocket and unfolded the scrap of paper, the one with the Navajo words he had copied from the intercepts. He traced them with his finger, as if they were prayer beads. When the broadcast ended, he stood and walked out of the bunker. The streets were full of stunned faces. The empire was gone. But for Tanaka, the realization carried a strange calm. He thought of the voices he'd spent years chasing, the ones that had defied every cipher. Somewhere across the ocean, those men were probably going home. He whispered to no one, "You won. Not because your code was strong, but because your spirit was." Months later, Allied occupation troops began arriving. Tanaka avoided them. He lived quietly, repairing radios for a living, trying to forget the sounds that once haunted him. But sometimes, when he tuned through the frequencies at night, he could almost hear it again, that flowing rhythmic speech. He'd close his eyes and smile. He didn't know the words, but he knew what they meant. We endure. Thousands of miles away, on a ship bound for home, Ben Yazzie leaned on the railing, watching the Pacific roll beneath him. The war was over. The ocean that had swallowed so much blood now looked calm again. He took a deep breath, and whispered in Navajo. For those who listened but never understood, may they rest. The wind caught his words and carried them east, across the waves, toward a land of ashes and silence. And somewhere in Tokyo, a former cryptographer paused by his radio, hearing only static, yet feeling, inexplicably, at peace. The wind over Okinawa carried a smell no man could forget: salt, smoke, and the sweet, sick scent of death. The island was supposed to be a stepping stone to Japan. Instead, it became a graveyard for everyone who touched it. Private Ben Yazzie wiped blood and rain from his face as he crawled behind a shattered wall. His radio crackled beside him. The cord stretched through mud, slick with oil. Above, Japanese artillery screamed and the sky burned red. "Yazzie, we need fire support!" Sergeant Begay's voice came through the chaos, half drowned by static. Ben adjusted his headset. "Copy!" he shouted. His fingers trembled as he tuned the frequency. The air around him shook, men screamed, bombs fell, and the world shrank to the size of his microphone. "Toe shash, chedagahi, danazni." His words, ancient and sacred, flew across the storm like arrows of sound. In less than 2 minutes, American artillery answered. The hillside ahead erupted in flame, cutting off the enemy's advance. Begay dropped beside him, chest heaving. "Perfect hit. You're a miracle, Yazzie." Ben shook his head. "Not me," he said softly. "Our words." Half a world away, Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a classroom that no longer had students. The war was over, Tokyo half ruined. Allied occupation forces now controlled everything, and Japanese officers were being interrogated one by one. He'd been spared trial, mostly because of his language skills. The Americans needed translators, and Tanaka had been one of the few to survive the intelligence bureau. But the real reason he wasn't imprisoned was because the Americans didn't even consider him a threat. What danger could a man who had spent years chasing sounds pose now? That morning, a U.S. communications officer had come to see him. A young lieutenant, barely 25, polite but sharp. "You were one of the Empire's cryptographers?" he asked. Tanaka nodded. The officer smiled. "We read your reports. You tried to crack the Navajo code, didn't you?" Tanaka stared at him for a moment. "We tried. We failed." The American chuckled. "Everybody failed. Even our own linguists don't fully understand it." Tanaka tilted his head. "Then how did you build it?" "Not me," the officer said. "A group of Navajo Marines. They built it from their own language. Pure genius. Fast. Complex. Alive." He paused, his tone softening. "You know, some of them didn't even tell their families what they did until years later." Tanaka smiled faintly. "They protected the soul of their people, even in victory." The officer nodded, impressed. "That's one way to put it." After he left, Tanaka sat alone for a long time, staring at the floor. The voices still haunted him, the strange, melodic words that had once driven him mad. But now he saw them differently. They weren't weapons. They were a people's last defense against silence. On Okinawa, silence was impossible. Every day was thunder. The code talkers had been scattered across the island, each working under fire. Ben Yazzie hadn't slept in 2 days. His hands bled from digging trenches and carrying the radio through shell craters. When dawn came, fog rolled over the battlefield like a shroud. Ben and Begay crouched behind a ridge, scanning the horizon through binoculars. "Command wants coordinates for that ridge?" Begay muttered. Ben nodded. He pressed his transmitter. "Toe tosted wulachi du chedagahi." The words flowed effortlessly now. He no longer thought in English. The code was part of him, every noun a weapon, every verb a promise. But that morning, the response came late. Too late. A shell exploded 20 meters away, throwing Ben backward. The radio flew from his hands. His ears rang, his mouth filled with dirt. When he looked up, Begay was lying face down in the mud. "Sergeant?" No answer. Ben crawled through smoke, pulling Begay by the collar. Blood soaked the man's uniform. His eyes fluttered open. "Keep sending! Don't stop!" Ben gripped his hand. "Don't talk. Send," Begay whispered. "Our words will live." Then he went still. Ben sat there for a long time as artillery thudded around him. When he finally reached for the radio, his hands were steady again. WWII. Beish bichit sastid nadon. The transmission carried across the island, over the sea, into history. Later, when the battle ended, someone found him sitting beside Begay's body, staring at the horizon. "You okay, Yazzie?" a Marine asked. Ben nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He's home now." In Tokyo, the Americans began dismantling the old intelligence offices. Tanaka was assigned to help sort through the records. The files were full of the Empire's ghosts, intercepted messages, false reports, fragments of a vanished war. One folder stopped him cold. Inside were his own notes, pages of Navajo phonetics, scribbled in desperation. He ran a finger over the faded handwriting. Wulachi, Toei, Ahei, Ahei. He could almost hear them again, echoing in the static. He glanced around. No one was watching. Slowly, he took the folder, slipped it into his briefcase, and left the building. That night, he returned home and laid the papers out on his desk. Then, with careful hands, he began copying each word again, not as a codebreaker, but as a student. He whispered them aloud, trying to shape the sounds on his tongue. They felt strange, sacred, like trespassing into someone else's prayer. When he finished, he closed the notebook and bowed his head. "Forgive me," he murmured, unsure whether he was speaking to the Americans, the Navajo, or the language itself. On Okinawa, the war was nearly over, but the dying refused to stop. Ben Yazzie had seen men drown in mud, burned alive, and vanish in the air. He had stopped counting days. Only the radio mattered, and the words, always the words. By now, the Japanese defenders were starving, trapped in caves. Each message Ben sent brought artillery closer. He knew it. And yet, each time he transmitted, he spoke softly, as if the air itself deserved respect. "Wulachi, da nazni." One night, after a heavy bombardment, the firing finally ceased. The wind carried faint cries from the caves, the sound of men who refused to surrender. Ben sat near the radio, head bowed. He had no hatred left, only exhaustion. An American officer approached. "You did good work, son," he said. "War's almost over." Ben didn't answer. He looked up at the stars. "I hope it never comes back." In Tokyo, the surrender was official. The Emperor's broadcast filled the airwaves, his voice calm and distant. Tanaka stood in his small apartment, listening. The words felt like the end of the world, and yet, somewhere deep down, he felt a strange gratitude. The war had taken everything but left him one truth. There are some mysteries man is not meant to own. He opened his notebook again and looked at the list of Navajo words. They seemed to glow faintly under the lamplight. He picked up his pen and wrote one final note beside them. Language is not a weapon. It is memory that refuses to die. Months later, Ben Yazzie stood on the deck of a transport ship heading home. The ocean stretched endless and silent. For the first time in years, no guns, no orders, no code words. He pulled from his pocket a small cloth pouch filled with earth from home, Dene Bikea, the land of the Navajo. He opened it and let the sand scatter into the wind. He whispered, "Our words went far. Now let them rest." When the ship reached California, reporters crowded the docks. They wanted pictures of heroes. The Navajo Marines stood quietly, cameras flashing around them. One asked Ben, "What kind of code did you use out there?" He smiled faintly. "Just our mother tongue." They didn't understand. They never would. But that was all right. Some truths belong only to those who carry them. Years later, when Tanaka was an old man, he opened a small bookstore in Kyoto. He taught languages to students who wanted to see the world, English, French, Chinese. But sometimes, late at night, he would close the shop, sit by the radio, and tune the dial. Every now and then, through faint static, he imagined he heard it again, that flowing voice, the rhythm of wind and earth. He would close his eyes and whisper the words he'd memorized so long ago. "Hey, thank you.